Hi everyone, this is Chapter 12, which covers survey design, which was covered by Kelly, Whitney, Morgan, and Daniel, and this chapter starts on page 378 if you'd like to follow along. So what is survey research? Survey research is a procedure that is used to collect attitudes, opinions, behaviors, or characteristics of a specific population. Researchers use different methods of survey, including mailed questionnaires and one-on-one interviews. The researcher can then analyze the data and identify trends that allow them to test research questions. Survey research does not involve a researcher providing treatment to their participants, so it is difficult to explain cause and effect data. Surveys are used in quantitative research. Because surveys do not offer in-depth explanations, they are best used when one is looking to describe trends or opinions, such as community interests or policy issues. Surveys allow researchers to investigate individual beliefs and attitudes about a number of things and can be used to follow up with survey takers 5, 10, or 15 years later. There are two main types of surveys: cross-sectional and longitudinal. Cross-sectional surveys are used when the researcher collects data at one point in time, and this gathers data on current attitudes, beliefs, or practices of the participants. Cross-sectional surveys are useful for evaluating community needs, gathering current opinions, and program evaluation. Longitudinal studies occur over time. There are three types of longitudinal studies: trend studies, cohort studies, and panel studies. Trend studies examine changes in a specific population over time. The participants may change, but the population will remain the same. For example, a researcher might study seniors in a high school. Each year, the students will be different, but they represent the same population. Cohort studies survey a subpopulation that possess a common characteristic. The participants in this study may change as well, but the common characteristic, or cohort, will stay the same. The third type of longitudinal study is a panel study. In a panel study, the researcher follows the same people in order to track their beliefs and attitudes all over time. There are four key characteristics of survey research, and survey researchers engage in the process of sampling from a population, collecting data through questionnaires or interviews, designing instruments for data collection, and obtaining a high response rate. There are three main terms that are helpful to make up the framework of a sample survey, which is population, or a group of individuals that possess one characteristic that distinguishes them from other groups; target population, the list of individuals in a population that a researcher can obtain; the sampling frame, which is which researchers choose from the target population to study. These are individuals that the people studied; certain factors that may limit a researcher's ability to draw valid inference from the sample to the population. And so it's important to reduce coverage error by having a good sampling frame on which to select individuals. To reduce sampling error, it's important to select as large of a sample as possible from the population. In order to reduce measurement error, it's a good idea to have a great instrument with clear questions and response options. And to reduce non-response error, it's important to have a rigorous procedure to achieve as large of a return as possible. There are two basic forms of data collection through the distribution of questionnaires, either via the web or mail, which the participants complete and then return to the researcher. Or the other option is through interviews, either in person, such as one-on-one or focus group interviews, or over the telephone. When utilizing the interview survey method, the researcher must design his interview survey with a variety of question types to gather the information they need. The researcher may also conduct quantitative and qualitative interview studies by asking both closed-ended and open-ended questions respectively. Each will produce a different result of information, even if the group being interviewed is the same. When conducting surveys with mailed questionnaires, there are a number of advantages and disadvantages. Some of the advantages are that it's a convenient way to reach out geographically diverse samples of the population, and it's quick data collection. It's very economical. But some of the disadvantages are that it's a lack of personal investment, there's no contact with the researcher, and the participants can misinterpret the questions. And so that's something to weigh if you're considering doing a mailed survey. When conducting web-based surveys, some of the pros and cons to consider are that collecting data is really quick, and it allows you to use existing tested forms and sample questions. And then there's the expanse of the web, which we all know can definitely be a huge advantage, especially with social media. But some of the problems with web-based questionnaires are that they have extremely low response rates. It's a non-random sampling. There can be technology or security issues, problems with junk mail, and users often change email addresses, so it can be hard to target exactly who you're looking for. For research-driven interview processes, conducting interviews should follow a set of procedures for each interview type. One-on-one interviews and focus group interviews and telephone interviews will each have their own. These procedures include developing or locating an instrument and training the interviewers how to provide instructions during the interview, maintain confidentiality, ask the exact questions, and complete the interview within the time allocated, and being very courteous and not interjecting their personal opinions while doing so. In one-on-one interviews, are useful for asking sensitive questions and lead to high response rates since the participants feel obligated to complete the interview, but not all interviewers or interviewees may feel comfortable disclosing information. Focus group interviews are useful for collecting extensive data, and participation by all individuals in a group and require the researcher to find consensus questions. But one of the problems is that there may be dominating individuals that would drive the conversation and would not necessarily reflect the consensus of the group. Telephone interviews are great because they allow access to interviewees who are geographically dispersed, but it doesn't get full engagement because you can't see the nonverbal communication of the participant. Survey researchers seek high response rates from participants in a study so that they can have confidence to generalize their results. Depending on the method of survey, the level of response rate will vary, which we talked a little bit about already. Surveys conducted as interviews tend to have higher response rates because they're physically present and feel obligated to show up if it's one-on-one. Mailed and web-based response volumes will vary for various reasons, as we just previously talked about. But researchers who aim for high response rates typically will pre-notify their participants, make sure they are notifying that the survey is being sent. They're following up with anyone who hasn't completed the survey yet, and sometimes they'll even use incentives to get the survey completed. So let's take a little bit deeper look at mailed questionnaires, and this is just one option for collecting survey data. And when constructing a mailed questionnaire, there are really 5 main parts that should be included. The cover letter is probably the most important component of the mailed questionnaire and should really include a couple of different things, including the importance of the participant. So really here you want to address why they were selected to participate in this study. The purpose of the study should be included, as well as assurance that their responses will be confidential. You should also include the sponsorship, so your advisors and institution's name who's conducting the survey, or that you're conducting the survey on their behalf. And you should also include the completion time that it will take for them to actually physically fill out the survey and how they should return the survey to you. For an example of a cover letter, figure 12.5 on page 396 is quite comprehensive. I definitely tell you to take a look at that. The questionnaire itself should also be very visually appealing and should start with some general demographic information to get a feel for who the responder is. So things like their age, occupation, gender, ethnicity, etc. Just really kind of getting an idea of who's taking the survey. The demographic information should lead into some close-ended questions that will give you an idea of some of the information on patterns or behaviors of this individual. The questions are typically on a scale from strongly disagree to strongly agree, for example. Then there should also be some open-ended questions, which will allow the responder to add in their perspective. This allows them to elaborate on the questions that are being asked. After the questions, it is really important that you reiterate as the researcher your gratitude for the respondent's time and candid answers, and let them know how to turn the questionnaire in. For an example of what a mailed questionnaire might look like, as well as sample closed-ended and open-ended questions, Figure 12.6 runs from pages 397 to 400 on your textbook. So moving to interview surveys, these generally take more time than a mailed questionnaire because the interviewer will need to spend some time really developing rapport with the participant. So this typically is done at the beginning of the interview once a participant has already received a formal invitation to the interview and is agreed to a time and location. And so when training interviewers, if there's more than one who will be conducting the interview, it is important to establish guidelines so you have consistency. This may be a set of questions with some additional ways to probe based on the respondent's answers to the questions. If the interview is being conducted over the phone, having a guide is particularly important because there's less of an opportunity to build the rapport and see some of those visual communications that you would see in person, and that's just based on the nature of the interview setting. During the interview, it's also important to have set guidelines to ensure that responses are either being recorded by the interviewer or that the entire interview is being recorded on a tape recorder. This will allow researchers to analyze the responses at a later time. Following the interview, it is also important for each interviewer to jot down notes that may be helpful in explaining the data they've collected. This may be their own thoughts or feelings about the interview. For example, if an interviewer was not particularly interested in what was being said, they may have been less likely to probe deeper into questions, and something like this should really be noted. Another example might be if the interviewer had difficulty hearing the participant based on the nature of where the interview took place, as this may be influential on the data as well. For an example of telephone interview guide, please see Figure 12.8 on page 404 of your textbook. And when we're conducting interviews or questionnaires, any types of survey research, we really need to be aware that there are ethical issues that must be taken into consideration. First, individuals participating in the survey should be fully informed about the aim of the survey, and their consent to participate must be fully obtained. Participants should volunteer and should not be forced in any way to take place in the survey. In addition, when giving incentives to encourage individuals to participate in a survey, the incentives themselves should not be too excessive, and the benefits which are guaranteed when participating should also be fully articulated. The safety of the respondent should also be fully maintained, and respondents should not be harmed physically or emotionally in any way during the survey process. When interviewers are sent to conduct a survey, it also must be made clear that they will be safe and not put their safety at risk as well. Another important ethical issue is confidentiality. Surveys should be completed anonymously, and the confidentiality of the responses needs to be fully protected. Efforts should be made to make sure that the links between the participants and responses are minimized, such as by using IDs that only the research team knows, and also destroying survey instruments once the survey is concluded. So far, we've covered what survey research is and some of the methods used. Now, to tie everything together, we will go through the steps that should be followed when conducting a survey. First, you must decide whether a survey will be the best design to use for the study. Surveys are most suitable for assessing the trends of population, comparing groups, or describing the relationship between variables. Second, the research questions and hypotheses must be identified. Third, the population must be identified. Once the population is determined and a list of members are compiled, a sample can be selected using random sampling procedures. Next, you must decide whether the survey study will be cross-sectional or longitudinal. You must also determine whether the data will be collected using questionnaires or interviews, weighing the advantages and disadvantages of each procedure. Next, an instrument needs to be either developed or located to collect or measure the variables in the study. Then, the data needs to be collected, making sure that there is good response rate from a minimal response bias. The data is then analyzed to address the research questions and hypotheses. Finally, the report is written using a standard quantitative structure. The detailed information about the procedures of the survey should be described in the methods section of the study. Finally, it's always important to evaluate whether your survey was productive. A survey of good quality should meet the following criteria. First, it should clearly identify the target population and the sample. The sample should have adequate size that is systematically derived. The survey should use either a longitudinal or cross-sectional design that matches the research questions or hypotheses. It should clearly specify whether a questionnaire or interview will be used to collect the data and why it was selected, and determined whether scores from them will likely be reliable and valid based on past use. It should use appropriate data analysis procedures to answer the research question and hypothesis. Finally, it should be written in a standard structure and also acknowledge ethical issues. So thank you guys so much for following us through the survey designs chapter. These are a few resources that we found helpful as we were going through this information and trying to help you guys understand this chapter of our text. Please let us know if you have any questions, and we look forward to conversing with you this week.